Welcome back to the Wintry Wyvern, and we've got some exciting news. Folk of the Feywild is the newest Unearthed Arcana released by Wizards of the Coast, giving us a few new races related to the mystical mirror realm we've come to know and love. The Feywild is a corner of D&D lore that they haven't yet explored too heavily in 5th edition, and with enough fans clamoring for it, they finally delivered. Today we're talking about the Fairy, the Hobgoblin of the Feywild, the Owlfolk, and the Rabbitfolk as new options to bring to your table. Timestamps are below, the doc is listed in the description so you can read along, so let's get into it. The Feywild, known as the echo of the material plane we all live upon, is a distorted realm filled with fantastical and mischievous beings touched by wild, errant magic. We've come to know the Feywild through older playable races. The Eldrin, forerunners to the Elven people, Satyrs and Centaurs are the closest we've gotten to playing as inhabitants of this separate world. This new playtest material offers us 4 more options, that we might bring the Feywild's untamed beauty and trickery to the greater realm. Before we jump into the races, we find a couple key notes that point us towards what we might expect in future releases. Contrary to popular belief, this document is proof that Wizards of the Coast isn't abandoning the term races, still using it to describe ancestries of a character at their birth. The term lineages, used in the recent Gothic Lineages UA, seems to be reserved for transformative changes that occur during a character's lifetime. Just like the lineages, however, these races follow the customizable approach that will likely be standard for all future releases. You can choose your ability scores as you like, and they offer a new spread of points. 1 point in 3 separate stats, as opposed to the +2 in one stat and +1 in the other that we've seen in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Seeing as the new guidebook coming out, Van Richten's Guide to Ravenloft, is very close to print, this might be a change they also implement in the Gothic Lineages when they come to their official release. Of course, you choose your starting languages as appropriate and are given an explanation of creature type, and how it affects what spells or abilities may or may not work on you. This comes into play in our first new playable race, the Fairy. Not to be confused with the tiny pixies and sprites, fairies are exactly the whimsical, eccentric beings you'd read about in your childhood storybooks and fables, though the opening paragraph doesn't offer much else. It does go ahead and detail a unique quirk you might have, whether it be the shape of your wings, the color and texture of your features, or the sweet dessert you might smell like. Fairies are entirely Fey, following the hoofprints of the Centaurs and the Satyrs. It means they're immune to a number of spells, like Charm, Hold, and Dominate Person, and vulnerable to a handful of others, like Forbiddance and Hollow. A small creature with 30 feet movement speed is notably fast, with its only peers being the new Gothic Lineages and the Goblin, which we'll talk about in a bit. Fly speed on a race is historically a controversial topic. We've only had 2 official flying races in 5e, the Aarakocra and the Winged Tiefling, both of which have armor restrictions that would otherwise prohibit flight. Fairies have no armor limits, a fly speed that scales with their movement speed, and can hover, making them immune to falling from the prone condition. They're also described as magical, meaning you don't need physical wings to fly, and you promptly lose those flying talents in any anti-magic field. This also means that as a druid you can wild shape and still keep your flying talents, since you don't need wings to maintain them. This isn't exactly a new advent, as it was also possible with the Protector ASMR, but this is definitely a fun option. Being allowed to don heavy armor might usher in a wave of strength-based flyers, if you're ever looking for your fairy to pack a wallop. Interesting choices all around. We'll revisit this when we talk about Owlfolk later. Druidcraft and Fairy Fire are great thematic spells for the fairy. Allowing them to use spell slots for repeated casting is clearly the direction they're taking for all future races, which the older races will unfortunately not benefit from. Finally, Fairy Passage is a wonderful way to sneak in the tiny fairy aesthetic without resorting to making the fairy actually tiny-sized. The size class of tiny in D&D unfortunately has its drawbacks, not being able to grapple anything medium or larger, and having a severely reduced carrying capacity. Wizards of the Coast have recently shied away from giving characters deficits on their race choices, at least intentionally, and this is a clever approach to keeping the flavor without sacrificing more than you should. Squeezing, surprisingly enough, has official rulings in and out of combat that a fairy player should be aware of. I will say though, as it's worded, you can squeeze through these nooks and crannies regardless of how big you've gotten. Even if you're using the Enlarge spell, Rune Knight's Giant Might, or other bonuses, you can still fit through that 1-inch space. The Hobgoblin of the Feywild is a new twist on the original Hobgoblin, released as a player option back in Volo's Guide to Monsters. In Western folklore and fairy tales, goblins and hobgoblins have commonly been tied to fairies and other magical helpers and mischief makers, even if D&D lore has painted it differently in recent years. Noctor, for example, is a goblin kingdom located in the Feywild, with a ruling hobgoblin wizard named Great Gark, Lord of all the Goblins. The ones listed in this stock are notably friendlier, adopting the Feywild's rule of reciprocity. Mirrored by their Faerunian military counterparts, they form deep bonds through tightly knit communities. The red and blue noses is a nice touch, calling back to the look of the Hobgoblin all the way back in 1st edition AD&D. Pretty standard stuff on the top. Dark vision was also seen in the original Hobgoblin. Fey ancestry, as seen in the Elf and Eladrin, typically also prevents being magically put to sleep. The Hexblood from Gothic lineages has the same feature as this Hobgoblin, called Fey Resilience, so either the name or the ability might be reversed later. Fey Gift is a new feature to player races, offering help as a bonus action to bolster a friend in need, whether it be through temporary hit points, walking speed, or warding attacks. This is a powerful feature because there's no limit to how many times you can give these gifts. The only limit is how many times you can use help as a bonus action. A subclass like Mastermind Rogue, which can always use help as a bonus action, gets a pretty large boost in utility. Additionally, the wording on this feature is a bit strange because the creature you usually target for your help action is the enemy, not your ally. As it reads, the target is an enemy within 5 feet of you. As written, your benefits would always go straight to the enemy, even though the intention is clearly for the ally that utilizes it. Finally, Fortune from the Many is a flavored improvement over the original Hobgoblin's feature, Saving Face. A great tool in passing difficult checks, attacks, and saving throws with the encouragement or peer pressure of your friends. They get to use this feature more times per day than the original version, making it a very handy failsafe. The Owlfolk are distant kin of giant owls. Don't ask me how that's even possible, I honestly couldn't tell you. If I'm understanding correctly, these fellows are entirely new to D&D, but are common faces among magical fantasy literature. Blessed with an eye for the arcane, silent plumage, and a tendency to sleep late, Owlfolk seem to be the modern and more specific take on the older Aarakocra. You have a choice between medium and small, and an improved dark vision range. Usually it's about 60 feet. Not quite as far as their cousins, the giant owl. It sits comfortably between 60 and 120 feet. I think there's a huge missed opportunity to give Owlfolk knowledge of the giant owl language, literally only spoken by the giant owls. Detect Magic is a spell available to Owlfolk, a useful spell at every level of your campaign, but only as a 10-minute ritual if you're not already a spellcaster. Just like the fairy, they have a flying speed matching their walking speed, which is boosted by any class features that might speed you up. They even have a reaction that lets them stop falling if they're ever knocked out of the sky. Not quite as good as hovering, but still very useful. Plenty would argue that this is a direct upgrade to the Aarakocran race, whose flight limits the amount of armor they can wear, and has much weaker features overall. I've always believed that the Aarakocra's strongest feature is its move speed at 50 feet per turn at level 1, making it the fastest race in D&D by a long margin. Anyone who disagrees, thinking that movement speed doesn't really matter, has clearly never DM'd for a flying archer. Owlfolk tops it off with proficiency in stealth, allowing it to fly quietly as the flavor text describes. Last but not least is the Rabbitfolk. Also a happy new addition to D&D, embodying freedom and travel. They are curiously lucky as they channel their Fey-like origins. I'm noticing here that Wizards of the Coast have passed on the opportunity to make these races part beast, probably to dodge any polymorph or wild shape shenanigans. You'd expect a quick race to have higher movement speed, but they've decided to capture that aesthetic in 3 of the following features. Hair Trigger, a pun on the phrase hair trigger, gives the Rabbitfolk a great boost to initiative. With stacking features like Jack of all trades, Rakish Audacity, and the Alert feat, you can all but guarantee you'll be going first in any combat. Leporine Senses is a boost to perception, something we commonly see in many bestial stat blocks. Lucky Footwork is a very neat ability to slightly boost your dex saves in times of crisis. This works really well with monks and rogues who can negate all damage from dex saves they pass through the evasion feature. Rabbit Hop is entirely new to D&D as well. You're offered a d12 boost in feet to your movement every turn, as long as you can move. A d12 is a bit of an odd number, seeing as most battle maps are measured in increments of 5, but one look at the jump rules makes it pretty clear it's never really been a clear-cut calculation. They've also been very intentional in using the word hop instead of jump, the latter of which is tied to a number of different features and mechanics and is always limited by your maximum movement speed, unlike hop, which is free of that tether. Overall, definitely a charming group of options. As someone who runs a campaign specifically about hobgoblins and the Feywild, this feels happily tailor-made for me. More Feywild content has always been at the top of the community's wishlist, and this UA points towards a healthy amount of cross-planar content in the near future. I'd like to make some videos breaking down these options even further, giving feedback towards their design and potential. But that's about all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment even on what sort of characters you plan to bring to life with this content. May your fairies always be flying, your Owlfolk always as quiet as the winds, and above all stay frosty.